click share. Can you get it now?
Yeah.
All right, there we go. Got it. All right. Thank you everybody for dealing with me. So it's nice to be here today. I think I see a lot of doctoral students whose names I know, and some that I don't. So I'm hoping that we get a chance to talk a little bit. Billy and Audrey, thank you for the invitation and for setting this up. A few years ago, Rich Rubenstein had me come and talk to one of his classes. I talked about my Lemkin book and sort of the methods of diplomatic history. And I think there's two of you here who are in that talk, so you'll see some links. So this what I'm presenting today is coming from the book that I'm writing, and I just decided to split it into two books right now. So the first volume is going to be called Dying in the Age of Thoughtlessness, and it's something about the peace-building industrial complex. And volume 2 is going to be the genocide prevention industrial complex. And so the talk today, there's going to be some methods that are going to be embedded within it. Hopefully I can pull those out. But I'm framing this in terms of contradictions. I got a little trick up my sleeve here. So the first picture that you got on your screen there embodies a contradiction. Every time I've landed in Bujumbura, there's either a UN or an African Union transport. And you see the soldiers coming in and out. And when I was doing some work in 2016 in Burundi, one of the opposition leaders who was based in DR Congo, but it was pretty clear very early on that I understood that this was the person whose faction was backed by the United States government. The Belgians were backing an opposition leader who was in Uganda, and the Dutch and the French were backing an opposition leader in Tanzania. And you realize real quickly that the political opposition, when they put down their guns, they become political parties. When they pick up guns, they become rebel groups. And there was a moment there where the person who was backed by the US in Congo had this fantastic thing that he told me, which is that the international community lectures us about peace and human rights, but pays us to kill. And what he meant by that is twofold. The one is those transports. Burundi is the world's most significant contributor to peace keeping forces in the world. But that's also the largest single employer in Burundi. And the other thing that this individual meant by this was that his own political faction was financed and supported by the US government. And that is very much the US government paying Burundians to kill. At the same time, there was working an international backed process to do peace building and genocide prevention. So I want you to embrace the idea here that peace building is done and paid for and financed by some of the same actors that are also injecting huge amounts of violence into societies around the world. And I got this insight when I began to think about this book there's a beautiful book. Professor Matua up at SUNY State University of New York has a fantastic book on critique of human rights. It's called Human Rights, a Critique. And the book is really about African conceptions of human rights. And in this book, he points out there's a long history of the imperial process, where the missionaries came from the same and were financed by the same political communities as the imperial soldiers. And actually, you have to understand the missionaries and the soldiers as being part of the same political force. And then that became secularized and is now taken on. The missionaries become the human rights actors and the peace builders, and the soldiers are still there. So there's a kind of contradiction that's at work. And I think that contradiction is important to remember when we're thinking about professional peace building and genocide prevention work. So let me hit to the next slide here. So I got my talk I was thinking about how to split it out for you all as PhD students here. I think it's important to talk to doctoral students about the way that your work builds across, sort of years. I think Greta is on this line. Greta saw me sharing my doctoral dissertation at some conferences. And so hopefully, you can sort of call me out to see if this is actually a building of a career, but at least in my imagination, I think it does. And since as the PhD students, this is where you are, you're building a foundation. And And so I'm going to talk about that foundation in stream number 2, that in part 2, when I talk about the 3 streams of my scholarship. And then I'm going to go use that to talk about the current projects. And I want to explain how methods can change, but also sort of there's a continuity there. Now you see on the screen, there's another contradiction I want to pull out real quickly. I'm writing an article right now that is it's taking the literature from genocide studies and applying it to the prison abolition movement in the United States. And you'll see there that sign, that's from Eastern State Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. And if you read it, the original prison was built by a radical plan, right? Linking solitude with moral and vocational instruction. And then the end there says, what a great model this was for, all these prisons worldwide for hundreds of years. And so there's a link there. The top picture is the Khmer Rouge S21 prison, and the bottom picture there is this Eastern State Penitentiary. And it's stunning how both of these prisons, the idea there of the prison itself was one of hard work and labor and solitude could lead to moral purification. And moral purification through imprisonment is one of the hallmarks of genocidal politics, right? So I throw that out there to sort of show you that article I'm writing right now. It's sort of a side project I've got, but also fully embodied with this idea of contradictions. All right, let's go to the next slide. All right, so the work that I'm doing here at the Carter School, right? I got genocide prevention education, right? And I'm doing some other work that's around practice, right? This all comes out of my research. And then the research questions that I'm dealing with are, first, how do we bridge the gap between theory and practice of genocide prevention? Second, does the field of genocide studies and prevention actually contribute to a more peaceful world? And I think that's an open question. I think that it's entirely possible that the field of genocide prevention does not contribute to a peaceful world. In fact, it might actually be complicit in fueling violence. And then this other question here, where do our international institutions and norms come from? And why does this matter? And that's a question that I'm still grappling with that goes back all the way to my first work. So then you're going to take sort of the scholarship that I'm doing. I got 3 streams, right? So the first stream is around justice processes. Second stream is around justice histories. Now, this is the interesting thing here. That, that court, that's the court in Cambodia. And what's interesting, as I realized, is that sitting in this court, you have all these international laws that are being applied. And then they're being interpreted by all these different people. There's people there with fancy master's degrees and PhDs. There's people there who are regular Cambodians. They come in from the countryside to watch. There's people who are victims and perpetrators. There's political elites from all these different countries and Cambodia. And you realize all of a sudden that same court process has many, many, many different cultural meanings that are happening. And that's a puzzle that I think is interesting. And then you can take this and you can sort of look at all these different courts and you realize, the court in Sierra Leone, like it looks like a bird, right? I like that building. But these different courts have different intersections of cultural and contextual histories. And that to me is interesting because you get one body of international law and it's interpreted in many, many different places all around the world. But even inside each of these buildings, you have hundreds of different interpretations of this. And that to me is a fascinating thing. You'll see how this kind of comes out a little bit when I'm talking. All right. So this is where my dissertation, Justice History, sort of emerges from. Right? This was my dissertation in the first book. So I want to talk a little bit about it to kind of, they got PhD students in the room. So the methods of this were really intellectual history, diplomatic history, and political philosophy. So I did a lot of archival work. And, this is the table of contents, right? So the one part of this book, Lemkin is the guy who coined the word genocide. And if you see here, this text, this is from his book that he wrote in 1941, published it in 1944. And he delivered the manuscript in 1941. And that's important because the word genocide is coined before the final solution in the Holocaust. And you'll see here in the little box, the definition of nation is really, really broad, right? Lots of different kinds of destruction. Genocide does not mean mass murder, and it does not mean murder, right? It means you can commit murder to commit genocide, but there's a lot of different ways of committing genocide. And then that little squiggly cloud I drew right there, you'll notice that he defines genocide as a colonial crime, right? The imposition of the national patterns of the destruction of the national patterns of the oppressed and the imposition of the national patterns of the oppressor. Now, that document on this slide here, that's in 1948, 4 years after he wrote Axis Rule. That's the UN definition of genocide. So if we were in a classroom, I'd ask some of you to read this for me. What I'm going to ask you to do is look at like all those different definitions of genocide. Let me go back, right? In the box. All these kind of like culture, language, national feelings, religion, right? All these different ways that oppression and group destruction can occur. Now in Article 2, you get A, B, C, D, E, right? Most of it related to killing here. Now, check out this kind of thing, right? Like look at D, imposing measures intended to prevent births within a group, right? Well, I found articles in 1946 and 1948 where, the women's NGOs were the ones that gave Lemkin the start for the diplomatic process. They're all in the UN, all these delegates are talking, right? And it's the women's NGOs that actually pick up this concept of genocide and begin to move delegations to support outlawing genocide. And they're talking about things like forced marriages, forced divorces, outlawing of marriages, forcible impregnation, which is the word in the 1940s that they used for rape. It's an unfortunate euphemism, but that's what it was called at the time. And increasing births within the group could be seen as an act of genocide. And notice how the law against genocide does not include any of those things. So the question is that we know that the first people who were lobbying for the concept of genocide wanted those things to be outlawed, but they don't make it into the law. Now come back and you say, well, okay, we also got things like colonization, because the colonization is nowhere in that law. Well, again, if we were in a classroom, I'd say pop quiz, why is the colonization not mentioned in the UN document 1948? Well, it's because there were still colonial powers in the UN. They didn't want to outlaw anything that had to do with colonization. They were doing colonization, right? And so what you can begin to see here is this process whereby the major powers are removing from the definition of genocide the kinds of violence that they are themselves committing and therefore want to legalize. That's like if all of you are bank robbers and I put you in charge of writing a law against outlawing bank robbery, you would produce a law to outlaw bank robbery, but it would legalize all the ways that each of you commit bank robbery. Right? So what you have here is this process of erasure from the law, right? And then the text actually becomes a text that is designed to legalize the kind of violence that great powers are committing in the name of peace, right? And you can see that, like, the groups. I'm pointing to my screen. You can't see my screen. It looks freaky to you. I'm pointing at my finger. Sorry about that. But if you look at Article 2, genocide is an intent to kill a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group as such, right? Well, what happened to economic groups? So Stalin got rid of that. Right? It goes on and on and on. So now you have violence around the world, like in the Philippines, an attempt to destroy every single drug addict in the whole country by Duarte, right? Tens of thousands of people murdered and dead, floating up in the water. That's not legally genocide because the act of violence was not committed against a protected group, right? So now we get this process here where all of a sudden you can start to see that this law is actually a product of great powers trying to protect their own interests. So Lemkin himself describes the Genocide Convention as a failure, complete failure. These two quotes really stand with me. And then the world, however, remembers Lemkin as a hero, right? So he sees himself as a failure because he just watched his idea of genocide get ripped to pieces. The world remembers him as a hero. That's interesting. But then he does something else. He spends his time in the 1950s forgetting about international law and working to outlaw genocide within the domestic laws of as many countries as he can. And that's going to be sort of interesting thing as we begin to think about. And then he does something else in the 1950s. He's attempting to prosecute Soviet genocides and French genocides against Muslims in Africa. And that's, you come back and you say, well, wait a second, he's trying to prosecute that internationally, Doug. You just said international law is a failure. Yeah, Lemkin doesn't care about getting convictions. He wants to raise consciousness, right? So he's using international law as a way of building global consciousness. And that's interesting. So now the question is like all of a sudden you go from that dissertation, right? And you're beginning to see the way politics, international law functions. And then, then I began to do all this. I actually, the Foreign Service Institute, where you're training, I was training US Foreign Service officers in genocide prevention. And you begin to see that actually the things that are taught in the field are very, very different than the things that they actually sort of need for their education. And there's a huge gap there between the theory and the practice. I mean, it's massive, it's huge, right? All right, let's go past that. I'm going to skip that one. Don't have time for that one. All right, keep going, keep going. That's not getting at the methods I want to talk about. I got ambitious here. All right. So you're going to come back and I'm going to be talking about like this book that I'm doing. And now the question is that I know that the concepts that we've got, the laws that we have, the ways that we think about peace, they're not value neutral, right? These ideas are created by people, and these ideas benefit some people at the expense of others. So what I've been doing for the last few years is writing a book about, I'm calling this Dying in the Age of Thoughtlessness, which is to say, maybe it's possible that the peace building field actually creates more of a problem. How does it create more of a problem? Well, think about the Genocide Convention. This allowed major powers that were actively committing mass murder and horrendous, horrendous violations against their own citizens and human beings all around the world. This allowed them to present themselves as actors working in the name of peace. And then there's an industry that happens in international institutions and NGOs and think tanks and universities that begin to hire people and train students to go work in that industry. And it's entirely possible, therefore, that massive amounts of destructive conflict are happening in the name of doing good. And so for me, the way that I got at this is actually this insight that comes from Hegel's book, Phenomenology of the Spirit. And so in this, Hegel is forcing us, I'm going to read this quote from Hegel. It's from the first chapter of the book. So Hegel writes, to pit this single insight that in the absolute everything is the same against the full body of articulated cognition, which at least seeks to demand such fulfillment, to palm off its absolute as the night in which I got to move there we go, moving the window, to palm off, I can't get the window to go, there we go. To palm off its absolute as the night in which, as the saying goes, all cows are black. This is cognition naively reduced to vacuity, right? And what Hegel meant here was something very, very concrete about how we know the world, which is think about if you're going to take a basic methods class, it's political science, sociological methods, right, or psychology and so forth, you're going to spend a significant amount of time talking about concept construction. How do we create concepts? And when we do that, we're beginning to do this process by which we have a universal theory of knowledge. And then underneath those concepts is underpinned by this idea that all of our knowledge and our way of thinking provides a universal basis from which our categories are derived. So then what happens is once you do that, when you look out at the world, you begin to see all of a sudden the world starts to look the same. So this is something that happens a lot of the times in human rights scholarship. You take an act, for instance, let's pick one. So Sally Engel Mary has a very, very good book. It's called The Seductions of Quantification. So Mary says, she takes, for example, domestic violence in New York City, right? And she creates 5 or 6 concepts. She pulls them out. So these are 5 or 6 and most important concepts when studying domestic violence. Now, you can take those concepts and apply them to New York City, but then you can go and apply them to Sweden, and you can apply them to Kenya, and you can apply them to, right, all around the world. You can do it in Japan, anywhere in the world. And you can begin to get what you think is a global portrait of domestic violence. But in doing that, what you're doing is you're removing the context by which each of those actions is situated contextually, historically, culturally, and so forth. And so in the one hand, you zoom out and you get a global portrait of something, and you can think, wow, look at this. The whole world looks the same. You can match trends. You can measure trends. You can say, oh, this country is doing better in terms of these kinds of outputs. But then you come back and you say, well, wait a second, let's go back to New York City. And you discover that when you scratch the surface, even in New York City, right, you have thousands of different kinds of contexts in which all these different actions maybe possibly cannot be understood as one and the same. So what Hegel's getting at here is something like this, that social science, it's necessary to create these universal concepts. But when we do that, right, we lose the ability to tell the difference between the contexts. And so what happens is that we flatten out human motivations into universal categories. And when we do that, you know, and by the way, we need to do that to create generalizable research, right, on identity or democracy or whatever. But when we do that, all of the distinctions and differences between empirical phenomena are then erased, and the world will appear the same. Now, there's something really significant that happens. I'm going to go here. Okay, I didn't prepare my slides in the right way. All right. So when we erase that difference and that context, we get this idea that actions, human actions in conflict in anything, therefore share certain kinds of motivations. And once we do that, we lose the importance of the contextual of the individual. So I first got this sense, this is the UN compound in Bujumbura. And if you look there, like there's like a fence, right? Aluminum fence. And then you get these kind of trailers, like modular housing. Each one has an air conditioner. And so, Burundi is actually not a hot country. It's very beautiful, windy, nice, like climate. But so you walk in there and it's like freezing cold. You need like a winter jacket, right? And it's really loud. So there's like this loud buzzing that happens. And then you step back and you see people who are doing they got all the sticky notes because they're doing conflict mapping, right? Just like you teach students at the Carter School to do conflict mapping with sticky notes, right? A lot of you, if you went to the undergraduate or the master's program, you did that, right? You got a professor. You look about drivers of conflicts. You look about sort of feedback loops. You do parties and interests. And so you step into this UN compound, right? You're like, there's more sticky notes in this building, the whole country, right? And they're all hanging up there. And then you look and you see all the people in there, they got the numbers, they crunch the numbers, right? And that's when I began to think about Hegel had something to offer, right? The international experts come in, they measure, they study, they do conflict mapping, they all got their fancy degrees. And, and then the world suddenly looks the same to them as it does anywhere else. And so when they do that, they miss the actual conflict. They miss it, it's gone, evaporated. And I had this moment where there was the person who was running the dialogue, was 26 years old, just had her master's degree from Columbia University, and she had a stack of Chris Mitchell's books on her desk. She was reading all of Chris Mitchell's books, right? I walked in, I was like, what are you doing? She's like, well, you teach at the Carter School. I'm like, yeah. I was like, can you help me learn Chris Mitchell's books? And I'm like, the first thing Chris Mitchell will tell you is put the books down. Like, what are you doing? Like, this is bizarre, right? But that's the logic, right? I'm just going to learn how to do negotiations. I'm going to learn the categories I've been taught in grad school. I'm going to apply it. And sure, you do that, but you're going to miss the world. So let's do a little exercise here, right? Let's start to talk about perceptions and so forth. Let's say that this building that I got here with the flag and the nice picture, that's the UN embassy, right? Imagine if we're using that as a metaphor of your peace building job that you're going to go out into the world and get. And what you find is the actual real embassy over there, right? That's the real one, which is actually the world that you walk into after you have your nice degree and you go and you get the job. Well, on the left, they make the architectural sort of flourishes there look like it's Art Deco kind of design, fancy things, right? Like streamlined, like one of those old rail cars from the 1930s. But in real life, it's pretty clear that that's a buttress that prevents RPGs from going into the building. And then on this picture, on the nice picture from the State Department website, they don't have the security barrier and the blast walls, and then the walls preventing regular Burundians from entering, right? But in the picture from Al Jazeera's website, you see all that, right? Now, those walls also are something else. Those walls are a barrier that prevent the US personnel in the embassy from leaving the compound. So it's either a fortress or a prison to some degree in real life, right? And so what I'm going to sort of suggest to you here, we got the cows coming on your screen, right? Hegel's metaphor's coming back. Work with me for a second. It's that if you are approaching the peace building field with these categories that come from elite institutions and elite degrees, and you're going out into the world and looking at it, you're expecting the world to look like that nice picture of the embassy, which means you're not going to see the world as it is. And that's Hegel's point. When you flatten out, when you take these universal categories and you apply them to the world, that's the night in which all cows are black. It's literally your perception is now unable to grasp the world as it is. And so in the night, all the cows in the field look black, right? You can't see the world as it is. That can do a lot of damage if you've got that kind of idea of how the world works, and you just go out into the world and start using your categories that you learned, and then you're missing the actual world that's there, right? So the book has got 4 parts to it, right? The 4-part thesis. The first is that peace building is a global industry. The industry is grant-driven, favors big NGOs and a professionalized workforce. The knowledge, number 3, the knowledge incentivized by the industry justifies the industry, right? This is the basis of your M&Es that you do in a curriculum, right? You generate monitoring evaluation, you justify the project that you just did. The journals, the peace building journals, justify the existence of the peace building field. And now once you're there, you're at a situation where you've begun to create these universal categories that you can apply all the way around the world to study things like civil society, right? To study things like gender, to study things like anything we study, democracy and so forth, and voting and all this. And so we're creating journals now that create the illusion and create the investment that there is a field out there of certain categories that we can know. And now we're in this situation where you've got all of a sudden the peace building field gets detached from the very kinds of peace building that actually happen in the world. And once you've done that, you've left yourself exposed. Right? Now, this is where the thesis is going to come. So I'll talk about the exposure in a second. But this is the industry, right? We're talking about a multi-billion-dollar industry. I mean, beyond multi-billion, right? Now, this compares nothing to the amount that these governments spend on war. However, that's not insignificant, right? And that's a lot of the jobs that students here at the Carter School want to get. Now, part 2B, it's a huge industry, but the industry is grant-driven. So you're going to get a grant, you got to have from these large Western donor states, you got to have the kinds of internal auditing capacity that they require. That means if you're a small NGO working in a field somewhere, like a little office, that even the concept of the field is kind of imperial, right? Like an anthropologist going from the university to the field, it decenters, right? So I don't like the fact that I just used that word, but nevertheless, the point is I'm trying to make is if you're a small NGO working in a community somewhere around the world, you're not going to be positioned to get these multi-million-dollar grants. Those big grants are going to go to the big players who have the ability to have the auditing and the tax credit and everything, and this tax exempt status and all the bank accounts properly assigned so they can get that money that's been appropriated by these different governments from the US and Northern Europe. And then the second part of this is that the industry creates dedicated career tracks, right, of highly trained experts. And then you flip this, and this comes back to that nice adage of Martin Luther King Jr., which is that, for all the millions we spend on poverty, the vast majority of the people who are paid to fight poverty are themselves not poor. And so this is what you notice. Most of the funding in the peace building field goes to the salaries of highly trained experts, who are usually the nationals of the donor country and institutional overhead, right? So at some point, I want to ask, what if you just gave all that money directly to people who were affected by conflict? And you cut out the professional middle class in the middle, people like me, who teach you, right? It's possible that actually that would be better for the world. Now, number 3, the knowledge incentivized by the industry justifies the existence of the industry. Well, how does this happen? Well, there's pressure on grant writing teams to document need and relevance, articulate a theory of change, and measure impact. The funding incentivizes certain kinds of knowledge. Then the research question, agendas, and methods are shaped by funders either directly through requirements and the request for proposals, or indirectly through the proposals they fund. Now, how do I know that the funding incentivizes certain kinds of knowledge? Well, you think about a theory of change that has to happen in a grant proposal. This is something where you say, we got the world as it is, we're going to go do our little project, and our theory is that we'll get a more peaceful society or build bridges or have some sort of positive output by implementing it. But your M&E, you're not actually going to measure the impact. You're measuring whether or not you carried out the project successfully. So step 1, a theory of change, is in philosophy what we call a teleology, which is where you assume that the world is going to end according to the principles of the beginning. And that's not the way the world works. This is not the way anything works. This kind of thinking was done away with very early on in the Enlightenment and scientific revolution. You cannot publish in a peer-reviewed journal an article that has a teleological hypothesis. You can't. It doesn't work like that. Can't publish it in a history journal, can't publish it in a medical science journal, doesn't work, right? But nevertheless, that teleology is actually the basis of the theory of change in this industry. right? And then the second part of this is that then the monitoring and the evaluation doesn't measure whether or not you actually had the impacts you sought. It measures if you actually did the project and implemented the project as you said you were going to implement it, right? So now we are really in a world where suddenly we're actually financially incentivizing a world in which all the cows are black. All right. Now, 4, all the cows now look black. The world looks consistent and manageable with self-evident technocratic solutions for world peace. And the thing is that there's actually incentive to make the world like this. Ziad did a great dissertation. Is Ziad on this call? I don't know. But Ziad did a great dissertation last year that took James Scott's concept of legibility. And what actually is happening, I'm going to cite Ziad's dissertation. Well, I'm going to wait for him to publish it first, and I'll cite the published work, is that I think Ziad's right, is that the humanitarian sector has a financial interest in making the world look governable. And look, according to what James Scott says, legibility. That's when governments take the social world and bureaucratic institutions take the social world and they categorize it in ways that they can measure. And so they seek a world that looks manageable, knowable, and self-evident, right? And so what you get then is this kind of thing that's happening in the way that the peace building field looks at the world, is it wants categories that can sort of, you can step back and then you can measure your peace building projects. And it makes sense to you that you were able to do it, right? All right. So now there's an ethical point that comes in here, which is that once you begin thinking this way, and this is the warning of Hegel's metaphor, is that you are, Hegel's pointing to a world where there's a tendency to reduce individuals and groups to generic categories. And this leads to a failure to recognize the complexities and nuances of political life. And so in some way, the metaphor is a warning that we should strive to recognize the particularity of individuals all around us in politics and society. And I'm telling you, I think my sort of message to the people doing peace building is that, you're actually, if you're studying the world this way, you're looking at the world this way, you're actually missing the real movements for peace that emerge. So the book project is then going to come back and do something I did in my dissertation. I'm going to look at the evolution of these concepts of peace building, peacemaking, peacekeeping in the UN, humanitarian intervention, conflict management, stabilization, prevention. I'm going to keep doing the stuff on mass atrocity and genocide prevention. And my goal here is to begin to show the way that these concepts are actually designed to erase from view most of the kinds of violence that's happening in the world, which is what we saw the Genocide Convention did. Took massive amounts of violence and said, that's not genocide, only this is genocide. And in so doing, it directs your gaze towards a few kind of perpetrators like the Nazis, but it hides the violence that's being committed by the US against Native Americans and African Americans. It allows Stalin to hide the violence that's being committed as he just, walls off Ukraine and tries to starve the whole country, right? The Swedish government wanted to hide the violence against indigenous peoples. The South African government said, if we outlaw genocide like this, what are we going to do with all the backwards people? And by that, they meant Black people, right? New Zealand government said, we can't outlaw genocide. We won't have a way of dealing with cannibals, right? So the Genocide Convention actually was an elaborate plan to hide violence rather than show it. And so what we have in these concepts, I'm going to argue, is that all of these concepts that we've got, the structure, the field, are actually designed to hide massive amounts of oppression and violent actions. Now, when we use those concepts, we participate implicitly in that continued hiding, right? We do it. And so the book is going to trace that. And then I'm going to go look at the curriculum, and I'm going to show how it actually works at the U.S. Institute of Peace, the UN Peacebuilding orientation. I'm going to be, I can make a lot of enemies with my colleagues, right? Looking at the classes, you read that course description from the University of Chicago, right? I mean, it's actually they're saying, we're going to teach you how to do this, right? Think about liberal peace, right? Democratic state building and stabilization. Carter School's got this, right? You are part of our curriculum. We're going to teach you how to do monitoring and evaluation, conflict assessment, program design. We're going to prepare you for this industry, right? Notre Dame, right? Got it. And so the book is then going to take my reading of the industry, sort of take it, and I'm going to then kind of hold that up against the critical peace building literature. So let's take that and let's sort of zoom out here. Now, there's a whole set of, scholarship that exists. And the key here is that this scholarship is deeply, deeply, deeply critical of the practice as it's professionalized in the field. One of my favorites is Shadow Peace Builders by Roland Kostick, who teaches at Uppsala. And this is, Kostick is this is fantastically brilliant thesis, which is that the peace building professional work that happens, right, it actually doesn't whether it's successful or not is totally, it's equivalent to flipping a coin. It doesn't defeat any kind of, statistical probability. It's not defeating a random test in statistics. So which is to say, it's entirely possible that conflict resolution, peace building practitioners don't have any influence on any successes. And then he comes back and he looks at these successes and he develops this sort of beautiful argument to say that actually there's shadow peace builders that emerge, these are the people that are actually doing the conflict resolution, peace building work. And then the international community is taking credit for it when it works, right? And that's something that I saw in the Genocide Convention, because all of these small countries, Lemkin's strategy, he writes, my strategy to outlaw genocide is to first get a coalition of the countries in Africa upon whom genocide has most recently been committed, and to assemble them with countries that are emerging from colonial experience. India, huge supporter of the Genocide Convention, right? China, which had linked genocide to the Genocide Convention to making sure the British wouldn't come back. And so you get these small coalitions that start to emerge in the United Nations, and their strategy is to create a position where you're going to force the major powers to have to negotiate on a treaty they do not want. And they do not want to outlaw genocide, but you'll force them to do it, and then you allow them to take credit for it. And that's exactly what they did. They allowed France and the UK and the US to take credit for the Genocide Convention, right? But they forced them to negotiate. And actually, what you can begin to see is this happens a lot in world affairs and diplomacy and movements for peace, is that the people who are actually doing the peace building find that it's better if nobody knows that they're doing it. And then they allow the great powers that are doing nothing or making things worse to take the credit for the good outcomes. That is a real phenomenon, right? And I'm going to tell you, you cannot see that phenomenon if you're a researcher and you're using these categories that come from the thought process and the journals of the elite field and the elite institutions, right? And there's a whole literature out there that talks about this, that sort of gets at this. Let's go to the next one. I'm going to take these two aspects of the book and I'm going to match this up to 10 years of experience in Burundi. Billy, how are we doing on time?
I think we still have about 6 minutes to go.
All right, so there we go. And then we take some questions after as people want. So what I'm going to be doing in Burundi is I'm going to be looking at the way in which Burundi historians talk about ethnic conflict and the way that the conversation over the ethnic conflict changes. So it goes from race, so Burundian historians use the word race, and they use the word caste, and they use the word ethnicity, and they use these different words. And what you can begin to see is that the way people in the peace building literature talk about conflict in this country changes as the categories in Western thinking change, right? And so that's significant. And then I'm going to do this fun thing where Evereste, I really like this guy, but I'm going to take 15 years, 20 years now of his book, and he rewrites his book every few years, and he changes the terminology in which he talks about Hutus and Tutsis. And at one point I asked him, he's a major political figure in the conflict in Burundi. And at one point I asked him, I said, like this, I had gotten to know him very well. I said, what are you up to with this, right? He said, well, it's very important that we continue to position the Tutsis in conversation with the changing discourse of European Jews, right? And I was like, what do you mean by this? He said, we need this for grants, right? You step back and you just rub your eyes because he's rewriting his history book so that he can be better positioned to get grants as the grants change. What more proof of this is that of the fact that if you're using these universal categories that are necessary for social science to work in this kind of Western frame, Enlightenment thinking frame, then you're just missing the world as it is, and you expose yourself to being sort of manipulated, right? And good for him. He funds his university from all sorts of grants for genocide memory. And so there's this kind of, aspect that I'm writing about in the book, which is that there's the peace building work and the genocide prevention work that was happening in Burundi begin to actually backfire. And what I mean by this is that, 2015, the world is saying Burundi's going to commit genocide. Burundi's going to commit, it's going to happen, ethnic violence, ethnic violence, ethnic violence. But the word ethnicity is the only word they had to understand that violence, right? And so so Vinnie Nimaramba and I, we walked around the whole country, 490, several years, right? 490 interviews, focus groups, right? Different kinds of works. And what begins to emerge, this is some of the pictures we did, right? What begins to emerge from this is that actually ethnicity is not at all how this violence is being carried out. In fact, most of the violence is happening, between two political parties that the ruling party sort of usurped in the peace process. And there were factions within these two political parties that wanted to ally together in order to begin violent insurrection. But to do that, they needed to begin to actually marginalize the members of their political parties who didn't want violence. And so what you got was armed sort of wings of these two, political parties, Frondebu and UPRONA, allying with each other to commit violence within their both respective political parties so that they could get their political parties to work together to fight the ruling party, right? So this is not ethnic conflict, but yet it looks like ethnic conflict to the people who are sort of invested in the industry that uses ethnicity as an important time. This is an important concept, right? And I'm going to be doing the same thing in sort of the same kind of a structure in Cambodia, where I'm looking at the way in which the courts in Cambodia, sort of they're actually miss the justice that's happening. And in some ways, there's a way in which the focus on post-genocide justice in Cambodia is actually done in a way that allows for tremendous amounts of, environmental degradation of the country to occur, that allows for the continuance of structural violence. And the argument that I'm going to be making in Cambodia, it's like Burundi, the genocide prevention in Burundi and the whole peace building industry that descended of the country misunderstood the conflict because they used their universal categories. And in so doing, they actually created incentives to increase violence. And because people in Burundi began to fight for proximity to the Dutch money and the US money and the different position themselves. And in Cambodia, what we see is that we have this huge international investment on the transitional justice process and around human rights. But the courts in Cambodia are the way in which the ruling party in Cambodia stocks the judiciary with judges who Western people think are highly trained and professional, but actually they're party loyalists. So, down the line in some province, one of these judges is now a provincial judge. They had a clerkship in the UN-backed court, now they're a provincial judge. And, a little group of villagers sue a multinational company, or the multinational company takes their land, and then the case is in front of that judge, and the judge rules in favor of the multinational company, right? So we see the way that the justice process in Cambodia has actually allowed the ruling party to totally control the judiciary in the whole country, when the peace building field looks at that as progress, and on and on. And so there's an aspect that's sort of, I got 1 o'clock running through here, but there's a kind of theme that's here, which is that a kind of a do-gooderism and an apolitical idealism is a problem for the peace building field. And then secondly, there's another kind of thing that happens, which is that, conflict is actually necessary for achieving peace. And in that sense, I want to come back and I want to say, you can't actually, am I out of the sharing mode? I can't tell if I'm out. Stop share. There we go. One of the things that's sort of happening here is that we need to be able to see the world and study the world in a way that doesn't lead us to different predetermined outcomes. And I think I'm at my 1 o'clock mark. So I'm gonna stop talking. I'm gonna let all of you tell me if that made any sense. And then I will watch the recording later and cringe with all of my foolish ideas. All right. Thank you, Billy.
Yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Ivan. That's a very strong critique to the current status of the peace building framework that we have. And for our audience, thank you for being with us now. Anyone who would be having any questions can put them on the chat box, or you'll be able to raise your hand and just speak them. Perhaps if I will just ask a question, is that from my presentation, what is very clear is that you mentioned about the problem of having this kind of general ideas and knowledge about peace building and how it has led to a lot of damage for the victims especially. So does this mean that we need to move away from this kind of, in terms of developing theories and concepts, do we need to move away from the macro theories more into micro analysis of peace and conflict research?
Yeah, Billy, that's a really, really good question. And there's a way that my answer to that is going to lead into Greta's question in the chat about everyday indicators, because everyday indicators is primarily about the micro, right? Trying to get at them. So I think that theory building is theory building is theory building. It's going to be what it is, and it doesn't mean that it's necessarily bad, right, or wrong. Like so you can't. I'm never gonna I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't do theory building, but there's a way in which the traditions of academic thought begin to build on itself, and ideas sort of begin to emerge, and then there's a push to find trend. There's a pressure to find these sort of universals, right? And once you begin that process of finding universals, you start to get to a point where, on the one hand, it's very exciting for the researcher whose ideas are now applied to Japan and China and South Africa and Washington, D.C. But at the same time, you come back and you scratch your head and you say, well, wait a second, like even here in Virginia, the social context of Washington, D.C. is going to be so different than Arlington. And even within Arlington, right, you can think of 10, 15 different ways where these basic concepts of, let's take like racial conflict, right? So in the US, the big one, race is going to be understood in dramatically different ways, even within Arlington, right? Forget Michigan, New York, and Virginia, right? Now forget Japan, China, right? And so there's a kind of seductive element to the literature as it begins to develop. And then there's a part where the literature all of a sudden starts to demand its own questions. And once you do that, you're really spinning yourself off in a space where the questions that are important to researchers become separate from lived experience. And now there's that old adage, which social scientists say all the time: I had a great theory until I actually, left my living room and went out into the world. And at some point, theory is then therefore sort of separates it off, and there's a kind of a gap. Now, that's not bad. That's not a bad thing, right? That's not necessarily bad. The part that I have a problem with is when people do professional peace building and they use those categories to justify their projects, right? And then the billions of dollars that the intervention that happens, and then the second part is that's usually funded by the same governments that are injecting massive amounts of violence into these societies. That's what allows peace builders to become sort of like this, it's almost as if like they're the good cop, bad cop relationship. They're still cops, right? Their presence is funded for a reason. Somebody wants something out of that. And trust me, people are not just, maybe once in a while you get a few exceptions. People actually want to do good, but there's limited resources to fund this work. You're going to fund it in places you want it, right? And that means that all of a sudden there's a potential for that research to become sort of an agent and an active tool in this kind of a process, right? So people who get their PhDs in the field should know very well, they should be very, very aware of the fact that there's value in being a social scientist. It's necessary. I mean, this is like, you can't imagine, I mean, just take go back to that Sally Engel Mary's thing, domestic violence, right? And intimate partner abuse. this is massively important that government should know what happens, right? We should hold governments accountable. This is a bad thing. However, there should be a kind of, humility that takes hold. And I think that's important because there's a kind of that aspect of it where the work that we do can be used in all sorts of various ways. And it's not politically neutral, right? So Greta, I think your question about the everyday indicators of peace, this is a really, really great question. And what my tendency to say, and what I'm trying to deal with in the book right now, is that you're still going to societies, like you get a big grant from USAID or whatever to do everyday indicators of peace. You're going to societies and say, well, how do you define peace, right? And so you're kind of doing like a translation, right? But it's still a donor country that's financing that project, that wants to know what those people think about peace, right? So in some ways, there's still that relationship there where, like, yes, we can define peace in all these different ways. But at some point, this is, it hasn't left that kind of, that area of, it hasn't moved into a different kind of structural relationship, because it's entirely possible for people all around the world to view peace as oppressive, and that's not what they want at all, right? They don't want peace. They don't want to talk about peace. But you can go there and do a focus group and they'll tell you what peace means to them, right? But the research question is still determined from that kind of, that granting agency that's going to pay the money for the people with PhDs to go around the world and tell us. And then secondly, there's the other question, which is, why do you want to know how these people define peace, right? And so that's the part where this process kind of comes into the back door. So I still don't think it gets us necessarily, it fixes that all cows are black dynamic, right? It just kind of goes in there and tries to get a finer grain, but it hasn't actually done the process of thinking about, maybe this concept is not something that the people there are after at all, right? Did I answer both of your questions?
Yeah, I think you answered them well. Any other questions from our guests?
I just want to say thank you. That does answer my question. And it's something I've been thinking about a lot. Why is it that the everyday peace indicators look, even though they're coming from a micro perspective, start to look so structurally similar to the international categories, right? So I've been thinking about this a lot. Thank you.
Yeah, this is fantastic. And like you walk around Ukraine right now asking everybody how they define peace. No Russian bombs, right? Peace, they might not necessarily want peace, right? Like that, negotiate with, like, I tell this to students all the time, think about ethics, right? And genocide prevention, like, you're on the train to Auschwitz, like you're the human being on the train to Auschwitz, right? Conflict resolution is not something that you want, right? Because yes, it might save your life. However, conflict resolution means at some point accepting the worldview of the Nazis, right? And so that's that point, Greta, like it's, peace might not be something that you want right now, right? And that's okay. We should be able to say that, like, and that's necessary to say that. So anyway, thank you for that. Sorry, I got a little, got a lot worked up over that one. All right, I see some questions now. Billy, what should I do?
Yeah, we are kind of running out of time, but I'll just take this chance to quickly read through the comment by Fritz. He says, perhaps I'm bad at choosing books to read on peacekeeping and peace building. But of the books I have chosen, it appears to me that too many get so entangled in theory, when more case studies that are heavy on history would help alleviate some of the problems. As regards teaching this to students, we used simulations that required a semester preparation to get into the minds of key participants and pushed much of the theory aside. Not saying theory is important, but we did want the students to break free of structures. Thank you.
Yeah, that's thank you. Fritz, where are you right now? Oh, there we go.
You are on mute.
All right, I'm not in teaching formally at this point. But I was glad to see you mention Kroc Institute. But all right, very, very quickly, because I don't want to turn this into a biography, but my background was more government international studies as opposed to political science, also a historian and literature, worked in these fields. But when I came back and taught, I taught under the rubrics of government or political science. I did for the PhD, all the statistical work, all of that. So I appreciate the theory, but at a certain point, and I recognize some of the books and all that, it really does become very structured. And you point out, and I really do like your talk, because you do point out the hazards of where this goes, and it justifies the industry and things like this. And so it was always a case of needing to break out, of this. And so this for in my humble opinion, is where case studies so often become so important. And then in the process of simulations, in this kind of preparation where students were reading history and geography, the various components that come together, you never know. They start to see things a little differently, and they don't get so caught up into the categories. And I have to admit, it's very difficult. What you're talking about is very, very difficult, because publishers, that's more of what I do now in academic publishing. I'm more in that dimension. Publishers want things structured in certain ways and presented in certain ways. And you're writing for your colleagues.
That's
So
right.
you're taking on something. I applaud it. But wow, you're taking on something that is really, it's interesting and challenging.
Yeah, and hopefully this doesn't get published before my tenure cases. Yeah. I think that the case study thing is right. Like I remember, so Victoria Barnett got her PhD from the Carter School before it was the Carter School, and then she was a historian for the Holocaust Museum. And when I first came to the Carter School, I was talking to her about what it was and her experience of going through a peace studies program. And she had already had 2 Oxford University Press books on history of the Holocaust before she got her PhD in conflict resolution. And she had this fantastic thing, which was that historical case studies are the thing that actually blows up every theory, because the theory doesn't ever apply to any case study, right? And so,
yes.
so we had these, because that's the point, right? And so we had these fantastic conversations about actual historical thinking is really valuable to put as a kind of sort of a thing. Somebody's going to go be a conflict resolution practitioner, right? And they're not interested in the peer review game, and they want to move on. They want to do something different in their life. The historical case study, actually, this was her point, it actually teaches you how to figure out what's wrong in all the theory that you learned in the classroom. And there's a kind of critical thinking that emerges. And you're sitting here talking about this with the simulations, and in the case studies, you're right. There's a kind of practical value to that, which I think is important to. So I think it's fantastic. So
I'll just give one example. The one that actually was very funny was we ran a simulation where we had multiple undergraduate and graduate classes, so we could fully staff all the countries in a Middle East peace. We were doing a Middle East program, and yeah, so Russia, US, all the key actors, and we ended up with Egypt and Israel. This is before Sadat Begin. We ended up with Egypt and Israel working behind the scenes to settle and resolve some of their differences. They were getting tired of the superpowers playing games and offering grants and monies and doing whatever, all things superpowers do. And the funny thing is that the professor, very wise, a smart professor, great professor, he finally stepped in when he got wind of it and said, no, enough. Egypt and Israel, this is unrealistic. You can't do this. We did this on a weekend. The next week is when Sadat and Begin said they were meeting. The professor walked into the classroom, each class that was involved, and said, I am absolutely so sorry. I am so sorry. I would love to have seen how this played out. He said, you folks are right. You saw through all the strictures that were there of why Egypt and Israel can't talk, and saw, oh, there is a dynamic that allows it. And after that, then I became a big believer that simulations are a great way to teach students. And peacekeeping and peace building, that's such an essential thing. And it would be interesting to with you understand all these dimensions, all these frustrations that come up. It would be interesting to see if you started to run some of these with your classes and see what kind of result you get.
That's fantastic. Chris, I think we got an email that's going to come back and somehow involve Billy for ideas.
Anyway, thank you very much, Dr. Ivan. Already inspiring a debate on this topic, so that's something positive. Means you're on the right path. So once again, thank you to everyone who made it possible to join us today, and we look forward to our next Methods Monday. Otherwise, thank you and have a blessed week.
Thank you. Good job.